Hey guys, tonight we drift eastward far beyond candlelit castles and drafty inns toward a peninsula where the stars once ruled more than just the sky. Imagine the city of Goryeo, capital of the Goryeo dynasty, where rooftops were tiled like dragon scales, and the wind carried both the scent of stewed cabbage and the faint, anxious scratch of quills against parchment. It is midnight or near enough. The court has quieted, save for the one building that always glowed after sunset, the Royal Observatory. Their cloaked men climbed creaking stairs toward their assigned sky-watching platforms, robes tugged by mischievous wind scrolls, tucked beneath arms like prized geese. The stars, bright cold and impossibly numerous, waited for them above. And so did the cats. Palace cats, specifically. No one truly knows how many, only that they appeared at dusk, like celestial omens, and had a habit of curling directly on the astronomers' star charts, particularly when the ink was still wet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always a bit magical to see the constellation of viewers stretch across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It is the late 13th century. The Mongols are occasionally rude at the borders, but tonight the biggest worry is a low bank of clouds drifting across the southern sky, obscuring the tail end of the Hyang constellation. One the court astrologers insist predicts royal toothaches if observed improperly. From atop the tiled pavilions, astronomers squint toward the heavens and mutter gentle curses under their breath. The official title of these sky scanners was Gangyokgum, roughly Bureau of Astronomical Observation. Grand sounding, yes, but the reality was mostly cold hands and bruised toes. The platforms were made of stone and lacquered wood, beautiful from a distance but slick as river eels when it rained, which it often did. If you slipped and shouted loud enough, someone might hear you from the kitchens, provided they weren't already deep in turnip soup preparation or yelling at a goat. The tools of the job included armillary spheres, gnomons, and something resembling a sophisticated sundial, all carefully calibrated, then lovingly ignored by the junior scribes who preferred the reliable alignment of stars with their rice break. Still, these astronomers were not merely sky enthusiasts. In Goryeo society, they were civil servants, monks, scientists, and sometimes very quietly poets. They believed the heavens told stories not just of divine favor, but of social harmony. A comet could herald a war. A solar eclipse meant the king should apologize. If Mercury sulked in the east, perhaps taxes should wait another month. Or at least that's what the astrologers told the tax bureau. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were sincere or just a clever form of state-sanctioned procrastination. Among the dozen or so night watchers was a man named Joe Juan, known for his unusually long eyebrows and a tendency to fall asleep standing up. Joe Juan once recorded an entire lunar eclipse while dreaming he was a carp. The scroll was preserved, if only because no one could decipher whether the fish metaphors were metaphorical or meteorological. His colleague, Lady Yun, was sharper. She preferred the high towers and the company of owls, which she swore whispered secrets about planetary rotations. Her charts were obsessively accurate. She also brewed a very strong tea out of roasted beans, which kept her awake and mildly hallucinating on particularly cold nights. Several of her observations still exist, some of which mention singing stars. a detail modern historians politely attribute to wind whistling through the tower slats. But even Yoon had to contend with the royal kitchen's smoke, which billowed upward most nights. The observatory you see was near the kitchens not by architectural design, but because the original building burned down. Someone dropped a lantern during a midsummer star banquet, and the palace had space only next to the stew vents. As a result, many of the Goryeo-era star maps are faintly scented with radish and charcoal. And then there were the cats. Again, we must mention the cats. Royal cats were not merely mousers, they had political instincts. One was known to consistently sit upon the scroll, predicting the king's third son's ascension, a fact which caused much squinting and head-scratching in court. Eventually the scroll was rewritten, the cat was promoted to palace companion, and the third son was appointed to govern Jeju Island, where it should be noted no one could see the stars clearly due to excessive fog. Back in Goryeo, the night dragged on. Clouds parted briefly. The astronomers adjusted their instruments with reverent clumsiness. A star in the Cassiopeia cluster blinked unusually fast. Jo Hwan nodded as if it had personally spoken to him. Lady Yoon made a note and sighed. The wind carried the sound of bamboo flutes from a distant guard post. Somewhere below, a cook shouted at a goat, and above them all the stars continued their dance. Silent, immeasurable, radiant. No one could say exactly what the astronomers saw that night. Their charts recorded standard alignments, nothing dramatic. But Jo Hwan wrote one final line before dozing off entirely, a glimmer like breath on water, perhaps a message, or maybe just the moon flirting with the clouds again. The Bureau of Astronomical Observation, or Gangyokum, might sound grand and mysterious, but in practice it mostly smelled like ink wax and whatever Lady Yoon's tea had boiled over onto that week. It was a department perpetually underfunded, perpetually overworked, and perpetually ignored by the rest of the court, until, of course, a celestial anomaly showed up and everyone suddenly demanded answers. Located in a not quite square wing of the palace with leaky rafters and excellent acoustics for echoing sarcasm, the observatory functioned as Korea's night-breathing lung. While the rest of the capital dozed, muffled by layers of rice straw mats and low ambitions, the Gangyokum kept vigil. It had one task: to read the sky and explain its moods to a kingdom that rarely looked up. Every night the roster changed. Jo Hwan might be assigned to Northern Quadrant star crawl, while Lady Yoon was given planetary shift check and tea ration inventory. No one liked being put on cloud watching duty, which essentially meant writing visibility poor. No stars, visible clouds shaped like disgruntled fish every 15 minutes. The observatory's schedule in its proudest form followed a rotation called sasin, an intricate division of the night into 5 guard periods. Each astronomer was supposed to record observations, log humidity check planetary movement, and update a chalkboard that no one could see because the chalk was always damp. Instead, most kept private scrolls hidden from senior scribes and written in cramped personal shorthand that looked suspiciously like poetry in bad moods. This is also where the sleepy wisdom of our chapter comes into play. Not out of laziness, though. A healthy dose of that wafted in with the candle smoke, but because night duty eroded clarity like water against ink. After 3 straight weeks of overnight stargazing, Jo Hwan once recorded a particularly bright planet with the notation large, smug, possibly judgmental. It turned out to be Mars. Still, despite the chaos, or because of it, the observatory managed to chart over 1,000 named stars, develop lunar calendars, and track eclipses with startling precision. Korea's Chiljongsan system A magnificent astronomical calculation table emerged from these very walls. Historians still marvel at how such sleepy scholars manage such accuracy while constantly being interrupted by goats, suspicious stew explosions, and occasional royal messengers asking if Venus's alignment justified a fishing ban. And the records were meticulous. Lady Yun, being more organized than several small kingdoms, introduced color-coded wax tabs for different omens. Green for good, harvest, red for imminent doom, and yellow for might be doom. But let's wait until we're better rested. Unfortunately, wax tabs don't store well in warm seasons, and one unfortunate storage box melted entirely during a solstice party, causing an entire year's predictions to blend into orange. One lesser-known scholar of the Bureau, Xiong Jin, specialized in wind observation. While most considered this, beneath them Xiong Jin took it seriously, very seriously. He once declared a particularly odd gust from the northwest to be carrying the sigh of a disappointed ancestor. His report was quietly filed under miscellaneous metaphysical weather, a category that only ever had two entries, Xiong Jin's, and a short poem Zhou Huan once wrote about a sneeze echoing off Mount Miaohyang. Every evening began with a formal bow to the sky, followed by the lighting of the observation candles. Carefully placed to avoid backlight glare, and a meal of cold, rice-pickled radish and guilt. The guilt was unspoken, but you could taste it. It came from years of telling kings, generals, and confused bakers that the heavens had declared their plans inauspicious. Yet among themselves, the astronomers found comfort in repetition. The sky was steady, if not kind. Its patterns offered a strange intimacy, a relationship, really. Lady Yun was known to whisper apologies to the moon if her observations were late. Zhou Huan would grumble about Saturn's inconsistency, like one might gripe about an old friend who never writes back. Sometimes something truly unusual did appear, a red flare near Orion, a sudden dimming of Betelgeuse, a small meteor that seemed to pause mid-fall as if unsure about continuing. These moments ignited feverish debate. Should it be recorded, interpreted? Could it wait until the next tea break? Historians still argue whether the Gangyokum's commitment to documentation was scientific devotion or simply a clever way to avoid military conscription. After all, a man with ink on his hands could not hold a spear. And Lady Yun once remarked that the stars at least didn't bark orders or complain about cold stew. And then there was the night report, a scroll compiled by whichever junior scribe lost the nightly dice toss. It had to include all observations, anomalies, and whether Zhou Huan had muttered something prophetic in his sleep again. These scrolls were sent to a senior advisor in the palace, who promptly filed them into a drawer beneath a jar of medicinal plums and forgot about them. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, the astronomers endured. Through fog fire drills and goat-related thefts, someone once stole an armillary sphere to trade for better soup. They persisted, because while kings reigned and ministers plotted the stars, did what they had always done. They gleamed, silently, patiently, possibly judging, definitely beautiful. And every night in that slightly lopsided wing of the palace, the Bureau of Slightly Sleepy Wisdom recorded them with tired eyes, steady hands, and the occasional poem about a cloud shaped like someone's ant. Now you might think that astronomy, serious, dignified astronomy, should concern itself with grand things, planetary alignments, the timing of eclipses, the subtle shift of the ecliptic. But in medieval Korea, it was often equally about soup schedules and matchmaking. You see, the stars weren't just glitter for the philosophically inclined. They were quite literally public policy, from the placement of a royal wedding to the timing of a military campaign to, yes, I'm not joking, the ideal moment to pickle a winter batch of cabbage. The stars were consulted with the gravity one usually reserves for divine omens or bad tax news. The calendar itself, called Nongsha, when applied to farming, was a careful dance between heaven and harvest. This meant that astronomers, despite their constant yawns and suspicious ink stains, wielded subtle power. If Mercury entered a disharmonious quadrant, the king might delay his trip to the coastal fort. If Venus was seen flirting a bit too enthusiastically with a neighboring constellation palace, staff would hold off on engagements, just in case the stars weren't feeling romantic. And if the moon was in the wrong phase during soybean planting season, entire villages were told to wait a few days. Historians still argue whether the crops actually did better or whether the farmers just appreciated a bit more rest. The line between astronomy and astrology was in this era not a line at all, but a polite shrug, and this was no different from many ancient cultures. But in Korea, the government formalized it with such sincerity that entire bureaucratic offices were assigned to the proper interpretation of omens. A scroll might begin with a dry listing of lunar elevation and end with, "Therefore pickling shall resume on the 9th day." The cabbage agrees. The astronomers of the Gangyokgam were especially famous for their Chiljong predictions, that is, tracking the 7 traditional heavenly bodies: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These were known not just by their locations, but by their moods, temperaments, and how they felt about your cousin's upcoming promotion. Joe Juan, of course, had a slightly looser approach. He once scribbled in the margins of an official report that Mars was looking angry again, possibly constipated, and received a formal rebuke from the Ministry of Rights. He framed the letter. Meanwhile, Lady Yoon was more diplomatic. She knew the court took these readings seriously, and thus couched her insights in delicate metaphor. For example, the moon appears generous tonight, a favorable time for the binding of alliances and for fermenting new dreams and beans, which sounded lovely, and also gave the kitchens the go-ahead to begin brewing soy sauce for the spring feast. One lesser-known fact about this era: the Bureau of Astronomy had a strong influence over the official almanac. This almanac, printed with painstaking care using wooden blocks, was distributed across the provinces and consulted more often than most minor deities. It told farmers when to till, nobles when to wed, and bureaucrats when to feign illness. If it said that the western wind will cause melancholy on the 5th day, you could bet that at least 3 minor officials would claim migraines and retreat to their countryside estates. And so it went. The stars whispered, the astronomers translated, and the country shifted its weight ever so slightly. All because someone with a telescope, a cold nose, and a mild headache declared that Jupiter was finally in a generous mood. Now, if you're wondering whether all this was accurate, well, that depends on your definition of accurate. The instruments were good, especially by the 14th century. They had celestial globes, water clocks, and sundials, sophisticated enough to shame lesser courts, but their interpretations, that's where things got deliciously murky. One famous incident involved a supposed solar flare recorded as a shimmering burst near the dragon's ear. This caused an emergency session of ministers, a rushed poetry contest to appease the heavens, and a royal edict banning the color orange for a week. Later it turned out the astronomer had just spilled lantern oil on the sky chart, and being too proud to admit it, described the resulting smear as divine flame. Even Lady Yoon had her off days. Once she misread a moon shadow as a sign of flood and ordered the southern villages to reinforce their dikes. Nothing flooded, but the villagers did report their walls felt emotionally sturdier, so perhaps some benefit was gained. Of course, all this celestial bureaucracy also had its enemies. Some ministers grumbled that too much power was given to the sky scribblers, as they were called behind closed doors. They argued that grain rot had more to do with rats than Saturn, to which Joe Juan once replied, "And who do you think governs rats if not Mars?" Still, by and large, the system worked, or at the very least it gave the people something to believe in when the weather turned and the rice cracked in its husk. The stars did not guarantee success, but they offered a kind of cosmic etiquette, a sense that the universe noticed when you planted your barley with good intentions. And if nothing else, the cabbage turned out fine. Now it would be entirely reasonable to assume that court astronomers, being learned folk engaged in cosmic affairs, were allowed a modest freedom of wardrobe, loose robes, perhaps a woolen scarf for the midnight chill, or a cap of their choosing to keep the dew off their scholarly brows. But no, this was the royal court of Goryeo, after all, where even your socks might be a matter of official protocol. And so for each celestial body, there was without a hint of irony a hat for the sun, a hat for the moon, and yes, distinct headgear for Mars, Jupiter, and even Mercury, who rarely got invited to celestial dinners and had a reputation for being fussy. The documentation on these astronomical hats is, alas, sparse, but certain woodcut scrolls depict court observers in what can only be described as elaborate fabric cones, occasionally embroidered with stylized starbursts, possibly worn at a tilt, depending on planetary alignment or personal flair. Historians still argue whether these hats were symbolic functional or just the result of a very enthusiastic tailor with royal connections. Lady Yoon, for one, loathed them. She found the wide brims interfered with her peripheral vision and made it easier for palace birds to mistake her for part of the roof. On at least 3 occasions she was dive-bombed by a raven while observing Venus. Joe Juan, on the other hand, adored his planetary headwear and wore his Mars hat to bed, once claiming it helped him dream in red. There were also ceremonial cloaks, designated for specific omens. A dark blue robe with embroidered cranes was worn during lunar eclipses. A silver-threaded sash was reserved for sightings of unusual comets, and a woolen wrap decorated with 6 tiny goats. No one is entirely sure why was mandated for nights of solar irregularity. Some suggest the goats symbolized chaos. Others believe a court embroiderer simply liked goats. One evening during a rather uneventful alignment of Mercury and Saturn, Joe Juan donned the wrong robe, one reserved for great planetary mourning, and accidentally triggered a palace-wide rumor that the Queen's horoscope had predicted doom. He spent the rest of the week writing apology poems and reorganizing the lantern cupboard. It was all terribly formal and terribly serious until it wasn't. For despite the layers of ritual, astronomers often use their outfits to express subtle rebellion. A crooked belt knot might signal protest at the emperor's new festival date. A mismatch between robe and sash might be a gentle nudge that last night's stew was subpar. And Lady Yoon once wore her Jupiter hood backwards for an entire week to protest the observatory's lack of spare quills. Still, the rules persisted. Every garment had meaning. The color red, for example, was associated with Mars and had to be worn when reporting military omens. White was the color of purity, suitable for lunar alignments and gentle omens like favorable wind for cabbage drying or goats unusually well behaved today. Black was reserved for eclipses and misfortune, or occasionally for astronomers who had spilled squid ink on their daily logs and needed a way to hide it. It wasn't just the astronomers either. Assistant scribes and even the men who maintained the rooftop observatory ladders had assigned sashes, each denoting rank specialization or whether they were currently on punishment duty for mislabeling constellations. In one famous case, a junior observer named Han Gil mistakenly charted a wandering star as a dragon's egg. He was promptly reassigned to ceremonial robe maintenance, which meant polishing tiny goat pins and airing out fur-lined cuffs that hadn't been worn since the Great Northern Comet of 1346. The goat motif, by the way, is something of a mystery. It appears frequently in the trimmings of observatory regalia, stitched into robe hems, carved into lantern handles, even shaped into the tiny clay weights used to hold parchment in place on windy nights. Some say it symbolized the constellation Capella. Others believe it was a running joke started by Joe Juan himself, who once convinced a nervous apprentice that lunar eclipses were caused by a sky goat stepping on the moon's tail. Regardless, the garb of the Gangyokgam was as much a part of the ritual as the observation itself. To wear the wrong robe was to risk misinterpreting the heavens. To neglect one's hat was to invite a confused message from Saturn, or at the very least a reprimand from Lady Yun, who believed strongly in cosmic etiquette even if she hated the headgear. It's easy to laugh now at the idea of sky watchers strapping on goat-bedecked cloaks to interpret the behavior of Venus. But remember, these garments were their armor, not against swords, but against uncertainty. When faced with a sky full of shifting lights and omens wrapped in mystery, a person will cling to structure wherever they can find it. And in the case of the Gangyokgam, that structure happened to come with tassels. So the next time you look up at the night sky, imagine Joe Juan adjusting his pointed Mercury hat, mumbling about goat conspiracies, while Lady Yun, stiff-backed and regal, scowls beneath the moonlight, her comet cloak flapping quietly in the wind. They might not have always agreed on the stars, but by all the heavenly robes in the royal wardrobe, they dressed the part. Every observatory has its mysteries, and the Royal Korean Observatory was no exception. But none were quite as persistent or as delightfully strange as the recurring reports of the celestial goat of Jeolla province. It began innocently enough with an offhand note scribbled into a junior scribe's log sometime in the early 1300s. The entry read, "Southeast sky, third watch. Spotted constellation resembling small horned creature. Possible omen or shadow of cloud shaped like goat. Hard to say." Now, most curious entries like this vanished under the weight of bureaucratic common sense. But this one, it caught on. Not because it was accurate, heavens no, but because it was memorable. And because once you tell an entire observatory staff that there might be a goat constellation wandering somewhere near Sagittarius, it becomes increasingly difficult to stop seeing it. Joe Juan, of course, was the first to take it seriously. Or perhaps more accurately, to pretend to take it seriously, with just enough conviction to cause trouble. He began referring to the goat as Yungnyeon the Celestial Kid, and would draw it on his charts with a faint outline of stars that didn't quite connect unless you tilted your head, squinted, and had already drunk 2 bowls of plum wine. Lady Yun was less amused. She insisted the goat was nonsense born of sleep deprivation and wishful thinking. Still, even she admitted that something peculiar did show up in that patch of sky now and then. A faint clustering, not quite a constellation, not quite a cloud. She recorded it as a transient grouping with suggestive angles, which is perhaps the most delicately skeptical thing one can write about a space goat. Over time, the celestial goat became something of an unofficial mascot. Apprentices would try to spot it during their initiation weeks. The night it was supposedly seen was marked with mild celebration, usually involving sweet rice cakes, and a toast with the observatory's unofficial and highly questionable wine stash. Historians still argue whether the goat was real, not a literal sky creature, of course, but a star pattern that slipped through the cracks of official celestial maps. Some say it was merely a misidentified segment of Auriga, or perhaps a refracted illusion caused by certain atmospheric conditions near the southern coast. Others suggest it was all a joke gone too far preserved in ink and stubbornness. And yet over the decades, multiple charts across different observatories, yes, even the one near Pyongyang, show faint notations that match Zhou Huan's original sketch. A looping hook of stars, a backward curve, something vaguely goat-shaped if you really wanted it to be, which as it turns out many of them did. There were even omens attributed to the goat. It was said that if the celestial kid appeared during a waning moon, a long-lost relative would return home, usually broke, occasionally bearing turnips. If spotted during harvest season, it foretold either a surplus of radishes or a plague of mildly aggressive ducks. The records aren't entirely clear. One particularly animated astrologer, Master Zhang, tried to link the goat's appearances to diplomatic tensions with the Mongols. He produced a chart spanning 20 years that seemed to suggest every major envoy visit coincided with a goat sighting. His evidence was mostly circumstantial, and his charts were later found to include several stars that didn't exist. He retired shortly after to write speculative celestial fiction, which he insisted was just as valid as the emperor's horoscopes. But back in the observatory, the goat became a comforting in-joke, a reminder that even in a world of rituals, formulas, and scrolls written in 7-part classical prose, there was still room for imagination. Apprentices carved tiny goat shapes into the wood of their desks. One year, someone left a small figurine goat-shaped, carved from plum stone, on Lady Yun's observation platform. She never acknowledged it, but it stayed there for 3 seasons undisturbed. And let's not forget the night of the double goat. That was a peculiar evening indeed. 2 separate observers posted at opposite ends of the city recorded a goat-shaped anomaly in different parts of the sky. This led to a spirited debate over whether there were, in fact, twin celestial goats, or if one was simply lost. Zhou Huan, delighted by this development, drew an entire goat zodiac, which included other barnyard-themed constellations such as the snoring hen, the jealous turnip, and the rooster who knows too much. These were never officially accepted, but a few bored scribes did copy them onto margins of less critical documents, which is why they still appear occasionally in confused museum collections today. It's easy to dismiss the celestial goat as pure whimsy, and maybe that's all it was. But in a world where nights were long, ink was cheap, and the stars themselves sometimes shimmered with just enough ambiguity to encourage myth-making, it served its purpose. It gave the observers something to look for, something not found in manuals or printed calendars. Something delightfully pointless, and therefore perhaps essential. So the next time you look up at the night sky and notice a vaguely goat-like pattern in the stars, remember you're in good company. Somewhere under a crooked tile roof and next to a steaming pot of questionable stew, Joe Juan once pointed to that same sky and said, "There, that's the one, the goat's back." And Lady Yun, with a sigh that could move mountains, simply replied, "Only if you tilt your head." The stars twinkled, the comets came and went. But if there was one constant in the lives of medieval Korean astronomers, it was this: the moon always stole the show. It was unfair, really. The stars had constancy, the sun had grandeur, but the moon had poetry. It had longing. It had lovers scribbling midnight verses on mulberry bark, and court scribes pausing mid-calculation just to stare at its curve like it might whisper secrets. While planetary charts were essential and eclipses could rattle entire provinces, it was the moon that lingered in the soul and in the margins of official reports, where Joe Juan once drew a sighing face into the curve of a waxing crescent and labeled it Her Grace, the Unavailable. Even in the official Goryeo court records, the moon was given pride of place. Its movements were tracked with more devotion than certain members of the royal family. Every phase mattered, from slender silver thread to full harvest brilliance. A new moon brought renewal. A full moon was for gatherings, for poetry contests, for festivals where rice cakes were offered and no one admitted to being slightly afraid of shadows. Lady Yun kept a separate moon journal. This wasn't required. She just did it. Every entry began with a line of verse, some borrowed from the Samguk Yusa, others her own. "The moon sits alone tonight, bold as a widow," she once wrote while observing its slow rise over a pine-shadowed ridge. This journal, of course, wasn't for the ministers or the king. It was for herself. A private ritual like brushing ink onto silk or listening to the temple bells echo in the fog. There was a particular tradition during the Chuseok festival, the Korean harvest moon celebration, when astronomers would gather not to measure or predict, but to simply watch. They'd bring dried persimmons, warm rice wine, and sometimes the bard who never truly left. He'd sing old songs of lunar goddesses and lovers turned to mist. And for once no one took notes. But the moon wasn't just romantic. It was practical. Calendars in Goryeo were lunar-based. The agricultural year hinged on its cycles. Entire political decisions, treaties, appointments, even executions were timed with its phases. You couldn't just pick a date. The moon had to be consulted like a very temperamental ant, with veto power and a fondness for indirect answers. Historians still argue whether the moon's symbolic power exceeded its actual celestial influence. But in that observatory, it didn't matter. The astronomers believed in its authority, not because they were naive, but because they understood something deeper. Humans need rhythm. The moon gave them that a pulse against the backdrop of chaos. Joe Juan, ever the romantic skeptic, once noted during an eclipse, "She hides her face not from shame, but to remind us she chooses when to be seen." He then tripped over a brazier and had to soak his sleeve in vinegar for the burn, but the quote held up well. There were naturally a few scientific moon oddities, like the time several astronomers insisted they saw a faint green shimmer on its surface. An atmospheric illusion, Lady Yun declared, or a passing spirit, Joe Juan added, scribbling it down before she could swat him with a scroll. Or the echo moon of 1357, when two separate reports described a second paler moon hovering just above the real one. This caused a minor panic, a major poetry boom, and a spike in the sales of reflective lacquerware, blamed for the illusion. To this day, the phenomenon remains unexplained, though one scroll refers to it as the twin-faced sky pearl, which if nothing else would make an excellent tavern name. And of course there were the moon-shaped charms. These were small, often made of clay or bronze and etched with lunar cycles. Palace guards wore them for good fortune. Scholars hung them over their desks. Lady Yun kept one tied to her inkstone, a gift perhaps, though she never said from whom. Zhou Huan had a larger one carved from peach wood, which he wore around his neck during observations, to ensure the moon knows I'm watching respectfully, he claimed. It also kept his collar closed in the winter. Even animals seemed to respect the moon, or so the astronomers said. Cats grew quieter during full moons. The palace goats, usually defiant and oddly political, would gaze up at the sky and bleat in unison, a behavior recorded twice and never properly explained. But perhaps the moon's greatest achievement was its ability to soften the edges of things. Arguments in the observatory faded under its glow. Reports grew more lyrical. Even the ink seemed to glide smoother under moonlight. One junior scribe insisted the moon altered his handwriting. He later became a poet. A very bad poet, but a sincere one. And on nights when clouds rolled in and the moon hid completely, the observatory felt a little colder, a little lonelier, as if the sky had closed its eyes. So yes, the moon got all the good poems, and the better metaphors, and the most secret glances from wind-bitten astronomers, scribbling by candlelight, half in reverence, half in exhaustion, because while the stars dazzled and the sun commanded respect, the moon was the one you missed when she wasn't there. To the untrained eye, medieval Korea's system of astrology might look like a tangled forest of beasts' directions and philosophical mumblings, but to the astronomers of the Gangyokgam, it was a well-pruned orchard of logic, rhythm, and the occasional deeply personal horoscope. Welcome to the world of the 12 earthly branches, or as Zhou Huan once called them, 12 perfectly polite excuses for not showing up to a wedding. You might know them today by their more international names: the rat, ox, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, goat, monkey, rooster, dog, and pig. In Goryeo, Korea, these weren't just symbols for organizing years. They were living, breathing filters through which reality passed. Birth years were assigned, one of these animals forming a zodiac that governed personality compatibility, career prospects, and perhaps, most importantly, whose fault it was when the stew burned. The court astronomers didn't invent the zodiac, of course. It came by way of China, filtered through 1,000 years of Confucian thought and seasonal farming, but they wielded it with distinct flair. Official star reports would sometimes include annotations like "due to the year of the snake" and the rising of Mercury, recommending caution in negotiations. Also avoid goats. Lady Yun had little patience for the interpretive vagueness of zodiac politics, preferring direct star readings. But even she once admitted after a string of failed predictions that perhaps the rabbit's influence on her birth year made her overly stubborn about celestial causality. Zhou Huan, a proud horse, blamed all his nap-related mishaps on the impulsiveness of my sign, which conveniently excused both clumsiness and his tendency to rearrange scrolls by the moon phase rather than content. But for all their whimsy, these zodiac signs were serious business. Matchmakers consulted the charts before arranging marriages. Farmers consulted them before planting. One particularly anxious tax official once delayed collections because the pig sign was in conflict with his ledger assistant who was born in the year of the tiger. too much tension in the grain accounts, he wrote best to wait for the rooster to balance energies. He was mocked briefly, then promoted. It happens. Even architecture was influenced. Temples were aligned according to favorable sign directions. A gate might face east because of dragon energy. A corridor curved to avoid monkey misfortune. Lady Yoon once tried to get the observatory stairs rebuilt to avoid walking in the path of the rooster during eclipse seasons. She was denied, but the carpenter did add a small carving of a sleeping chicken under the second stair just to be safe. Still, not everything about the system was tidy. Historians still argue whether the earthly branches were primarily astrological tools or merely convenient labels for scheduling and social order. Some believed deeply in their metaphysical weight. Others treated them more like seasonal gossip. And as with all things Goryeo, the truth likely lay somewhere in between with an asterisk. Each sign came with strengths, weaknesses, ideal weather preferences, and unfortunate snack associations. The ox, for example, was steady and reliable, but disliked fermented garlic. The monkey was clever and chatty, but prone to losing things. The snake, depending on who you asked, was either a wise spiritual conduit or the reason your cousin's wedding was rained out. Joe Juan insisted that pigs were secretly the most powerful of the 12. They wait, he once said, while chewing dried chestnuts. Then they inherit everything while the others are fighting. But the branches weren't alone. They were paired with the 10 heavenly stems, an even older system of yin-yang, and 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Together, the 12 branches and 10 stems formed a 60-year cycle, like an ancient celestial clock that never quite chimed when you expected. Most people used it to mark years, but the astronomers, they used it to craft narratives. Let's say a child was born in the year of the water rabbit. The astrologers would write a scroll describing the tendencies of that child: quiet but clever good, with letters likely to develop a taste for pickled daikon. These scrolls could be stored, referenced during important life decisions, and occasionally edited after the fact to avoid political embarrassment. Lady Yoon kept a collection of anonymous horoscopes from over the years. "I like to see how often we're wrong," she'd say with a rare smile. Her favorite was one predicting that a rooster-born magistrate would bring peace through measured silence. That same magistrate later started 3 brawls in the Treasury Hall and was exiled to a village known for violent chickens. Of course, the system had its blind spots. Interpreting zodiac signs for twins was notoriously complicated. One official report in 1321 began with, "Though both were born under the tiger, one appears more prone to shouting and breaking tea bowls." And combining charts for marriage compatibility often led to spirited debates about whether a fire monkey and a metal goat could really make it work. Still, it was hard not to be charmed by the effort. There's something endearing about a bureaucracy that attempts to divine human relationships through barnyard allegories. And something strangely comforting about knowing your temperament might be guided not just by your choices, but by the quiet influence of a dragon-shaped star cluster you've never seen. So the next time someone asks your zodiac sign, think of Lady Yoon rolling her eyes while copying a goat omen onto parchment. Think of Joe Juan carefully rearranging his reports to align with a favorable pig hour. And think of that poor staircase chicken carved in haste but guarded in reverence. Because whether you believe in fate or just happen to enjoy blaming goats for your bad luck, the stars, like the signs, are always watching, often silently, occasionally with deep amusement. They were watching the sky as usual, nothing out of place, nothing out of the ordinary when it happened. A flicker, then a glow, and then, as if some deity had dropped a sparkler onto the silk black night, a blazing streak cut across the stars like an impatient quill. It left behind a trail that shimmered gold, then orange, then slowly faded into the kind of smoky gray that only a comet could conjure. The observatory froze. Well, almost. Joe Juan dropped his rice ball into the ink. Lady Yun stood so fast she knocked over a stool, and a junior scribe, upon witnessing the sight, hiccuped with such force he startled the palace cat, who promptly scratched the side of a chart depicting Jupiter's mood swings. It was according to every available scroll and second-hand song since the night the stars stopped pretending to be shy. Comets in the medieval Korean worldview were not small, icy bodies minding their own business. They were celestial visitors with opinions, loud ones, and the opinion of this particular comet, as interpreted by Lady Yun, was decidedly ominous, possibly sarcastic. The records tell us it was first sighted over the southwestern horizon during the fourth watch, just after the soup pots were being cleaned, and just before Joe Juan's usual complaint that the moon was late. Its tail curved like a serpent, or possibly a horse's plume, depending on which observer you ask, extended across 4 constellations. That alone was enough to make the astrologers abandon protocol and gather like children spotting a forbidden puppet show. Historians still argue whether this was the same comet mentioned in the Chinese Tianwenlu for that year, or an entirely different celestial event. The timing roughly matches, but Lady Yun noted the comet hummed. No one else heard the hum. Joe Juan insisted he heard a sigh instead. One apprentice claimed it smelled faintly of boiled persimmon, though he may have just been hungry. Regardless, the official report was dramatic. A heavenly blaze of unusual width crossed the southern sky, shedding sparks and dripping with uninvited symbolism. Visibility excellent. Emotional impact severe. Possible omen upheaval or unexpected poetry. That last line, almost certainly Joe Juan's, led to confusion in the Ministry of Interpretation, which had to hold an emergency session to decide if unexpected poetry was a threat. Ultimately, they concluded it was especially near election years. The days following the comet's visit were pure chaos. Ministers arrived at the observatory demanding clarification. The high priest asked whether the imperial incense should be changed to cedar. One general refused to mobilize his troops until someone confirmed the comet didn't mean attack from the west. Meanwhile, the cook in the lower kitchens reported that his stew had curdled for the first time in 6 years, which he directly blamed on the comet and demanded hazard pay. There were precedents, of course. Ancient Korean records were full of comet sightings linked to everything from royal births to mass goose migrations. One scroll claimed that a double-tailed comet in 893 foretold the invention of sweet bean paste, though most scholars believe that was either satire or wishful eating. Still, the memory of a flaming cloud or bulgwang was always close. The Three Kingdoms era texts warned that flaming clouds often accompanied new dynasties, sudden floods, the spontaneous disappearance of unpopular tax collectors. So naturally, the appearance of a comet made the palace very nervous. And where nervousness goes, politics follow close behind. The Queen's advisors demanded a new reading of her horoscope. The Crown Prince allegedly asked if the comet could be bribed. And a provincial magistrate, upon hearing the news secondhand, immediately commissioned a 20-foot protective talisman shaped like a fish. He sent a copy to the capital with the note, "This should help." Meanwhile, in the observatory, Lady Yun drafted 6 versions of the official interpretation. She rejected the first two as too doomy, the next three as overly floral, and finally settled on a poetic but non-committal conclusion. The heavens have spoken, though their tone remains unclear. A shift approaches. Whether wind or wartime shall reveal, this satisfied almost no one. But Joe Juan added a drawing of the comet shaped like a rooster holding a scroll, and somehow that seemed to calm everyone. For weeks afterward, people behaved differently. Meetings began with glances at the sky. Marriages were postponed. One man who had been petitioning for a new roof gave up entirely convinced the comet disapproved. Children were told not to climb trees on moonless nights. And a goat which had previously refused to cross a certain courtyard suddenly did so with impunity, leading Joe Juan to declare, "Even the animals feel the shift." And then slowly, life returned to its usual pattern. The comet faded as they always do. The ink dried, the stew returned to its normal viscosity, but the sky watchers remained changed, if only slightly. Joe Juan began noting even the most minor flickers of starlight with extra care. Lady Yun wrote a haiku she never shared. The apprentice with the persimmon nose took up flute lessons, convinced that he might someday lure the next comet with the right melody. The comet never returned. Or if it did, it was shyer the second time. But in the Royal Observatory, a tiny drawing of a rooster-shaped comet remained taped to the storage cabinet right above the broken sundial that no one ever fixed. A quiet reminder that sometimes the sky doesn't just shine, it winks. It was the tail end of spring when the wind came, not a gentle breeze, mind you, but one of those determined sidelong gusts that smells like rain and opinion. The kind that rattles shutters, topples scroll jars, and as fate would have it, steals an entire star chart straight into a royal stew. Now, losing documents in the observatory was not unheard of. Papers fell. Ink spilled. Once a goat chewed an entire month's eclipse predictions because someone left it on a bench seasoned with radish crumbs. But this was different. This was a theft by air. A celestial heist, if you will. The incident began as most things did in the Gangyokgam, with Joe Juan complaining about soup. "It's too early in the day for seafood," he muttered, poking at the bowl set beside the scroll he was annotating. "This broth has Neptune's mood." Lady Yun, stationed on the far side of the observatory's western platform, ignored him with the studied serenity of a woman who'd once hand-copied all of Saturn's visible movements just to win an argument. Outside, clouds galloped by like they were late for an appointment. The wind pushed through the wooden slats and shivered the lanterns. A bowl tipped, a paper fluttered. Then it happened. A perfectly drawn, ink-cured chart of the Ursa Major quadrant, painstakingly annotated, labeled with Joe Juan's usual mix of technical notes and theatrical metaphors, caught a gust, danced briefly in midair, like a paper swan, and glided directly out the observation window. The onlookers froze. There was a moment of silence, then a thud, a shout, and the unmistakable plop of paper meeting soup. The paper landed ungraciously and with cosmic irony in the very cauldron simmering that evening's royal turnip stew. Why, asked Lady Yun, once the shock wore off, was the window open? Joe Juan looked at her full of innocent guilt. The air was thick, and the soup smelt judgmental. Down in the kitchens, the stew cook, a man named Byung, known for his strict ladle discipline and contempt for poetry, fished out the soggy chart with a long spoon, sniffed it, and declared, "The stars have opinions about dinner." He served it anyway. To the emperor. Now, it should be said that the Goryeo emperor of the time was not known for his sense of humor. He had once fined an entire poetry troupe for using a metaphor about geese that reminded him of tax debt. But on this particular day, he was in a contemplative mood, perhaps softened by the cloud cover or a favorable lunar position. He lifted a spoon, examined the now soup-stained map floating among the turnips, and asked, "What is this?" The royal food taster, already halfway through a mouthful, panicked. "A celestial seasoning, Your Majesty." Lady Yun was summoned immediately. She arrived with 3 backup charts, 2 scrolls of apologies, and a short essay titled "On the Impermanence of Ink." Zhou Huan wisely pretended to be inspecting the sundials and hid behind a gnomon. To everyone's surprise, the emperor didn't punish anyone. He simply requested that a copy of the soup chart be preserved as a symbol, he said, of the star's desire to be part of mortal affairs. This led to an awkward ceremony the following week, during which the stained map was framed and placed in the palace's lesser gallery, between a portrait of a mildly confused ancestor and a broken lute. Historians still argue whether this was a moment of celestial reverence or bureaucratic improvisation. Some scholars see it as a metaphor for the blending of heaven and earth. Others suspect the emperor just found it funny and didn't want to admit it. Meanwhile, back at the observatory, the event gained a nickname, the Stew Alignment. It became a kind of cautionary tale. Apprentices were told never to leave scrolls near open windows. Signs were hung, "Secure your charts." The wind has ears, and the kitchen staff began referring to unusually fragrant dishes as star-touched. Naturally, the joke evolved. Zhou Huan started adding flavor notes to his constellation descriptions. Venus, slightly bitter pears, well with cabbage. Mars, red and spicy, use sparingly. One night he presented Lady Yun with a sky chart annotated entirely as a recipe. She was not amused, but she did keep it in her drawer. There was even an unofficial observatory stew night held every second new moon. Staff would gather, share stories of failed predictions, and joke about which stars might improve the broth. No one admitted to actually believing it, of course, but no one skipped the stew either. And in quiet moments, when the wind was still and the moon rode high above the tiled roofs, someone would inevitably look up and whisper, "Do you think the stars tasted it?" No answer ever came. But the clouds on those nights seemed just a little more amused. Bureaucracy, like gravity, is invisible until you try to resist it, and nowhere was this more true than in the eternal Cold War between the court astrologers and the royal administrators. On one side, sleepless observers peering into the heavens, their minds full of metaphors and moon charts. On the other, men with ledgers, quotas, and a pathological fear of anything that couldn't be counted in sacks of barley. They were supposed to work together. Supposed to. The problem, of course, was timing. You see, while the Gangyokam measured nights in lunar phases and stellar risings, the bureaucrats below measured time in deadlines. Tax levies were to be collected by the 3rd week of the 8th month. Census scrolls were due before the first frost, and there was simply no patience for a report that read, "Due to an unfortunate alignment between Saturn and the east wind, we recommend a 3-day delay." To the Ministry of Grain Allocation, such messages were borderline treasonous. Zhou Huan, ever the diplomat in his mind, tried to soften the blow of celestial bad news with clever phrasing. The heavens express reluctance toward immediate collection, or Jupiter's current gaze favors reflection rather than requisition. He once drew an actual frown on a star map to illustrate Venus's opinion on land tax enforcement. Lady Yun, by contrast, was blunt. If the stars were displeased, she said so, in full, unsparing detail. This led to a minor scandal. when she submitted a horoscope that warned any attempt to enforce rice tariffs during this moon cycle may provoke divine rebalancing. The governor of Chungcheong took this to mean rebellion and deployed troops preemptively. It was a misunderstanding. A loud, expensive misunderstanding. Historians still argue whether these celestial objections were genuine or just the astronomers' subtle way of buying more time to finish their own paperwork. The truth probably lives somewhere in the twilight between exhaustion and professional pettiness. Occasionally, the bureaucrats pushed back. In one notable case, the Ministry of Timber Logistics decided to ignore a lunar warning and proceeded with a forest clearing near Mount Goryeo. 3 days later, a sudden flood ruined half the lumber, and a deer ran through the minister's tent during his inspection. This was enough to reopen the discussion about whether omens should be taken seriously. The deer, dubbed the antlered messenger, was later immortalized in a folk ballad sung mostly in taverns near the southern border, but more often than not, conflict simmered quietly. A clerk might misplace an observation scroll. A scribe might record a planetary alignment slightly wrong, resulting in the delay of a tax exemption. Meetings between departments became tense affairs, full of subtle jabs, cloaked in formal language. Joe Juan once wrote a haiku in response to a bureaucratic summons: "Ink dries faster than grain, yet you ignore the night's breath. Enjoy your mildew." This poem was unsurprisingly not well received. Still, there were attempts at cooperation. The Bureau tried hosting monthly celestial clarification evenings, where astrologers would explain their findings to civil servants using painted diagrams and snack-based analogies. One such effort involved arranging rice cakes into constellation shapes. It was going well until someone ate Mercury. Even so, there were those rare individuals who bridged the gap. Scholar Kim Yeol, a former astronomer turned budget officer, advocated for harmony between stargazing and spreadsheeting. He introduced a new form of report that included both astronomical warnings and suggested fiscal contingency plans. It was revolutionary. It was also completely ignored by everyone except Lady Yoon, who once called him almost tolerable. Yet even amidst the tension, respect lingered. The bureaucrats might grumble about delays, but they still consulted the lunar calendar before planning major events. They rolled their eyes at omens, but they still asked for personalized horoscopes before marriage. One minister even admitted during a rare moment of candor that he postponed a grain shipment simply because the stars felt judgmental. And the astronomers, despite their loftier view, knew the bureaucrats kept the kingdom running. Without them, the scrolls wouldn't be copied, the observatories wouldn't be cleaned, and the supply of quality ink would vanish faster than Mars during eclipse season. So the grudge match continued: cosmic insight versus administrative urgency, the sky versus the ledger. But sometimes, just sometimes, a compromise emerged. Like the night Joe Juan predicted light disruption due to planetary ambivalence, and the tax collectors agreed to pause collections for exactly 2 nights, enough to save face, not enough to cause revolt. Or when Lady Yoon drafted an observation using only official government phrasing. The report read, "The current heavenly indicators suggest a temporary suspension of major undertakings. Please consider postponement of all aggressive fiscal measures until the completion of the current lunar quadrant." Even the Ministry of Finance admitted it was beautifully worded. No one understood it, but it was beautiful. And so the stars rolled on, unconcerned, impartial, possibly bemused. And down below, the astronomers kept watching while the bureaucrats kept calculating, each side convinced the other was doing it wrong. Both doing exactly what the kingdom needed, just not always at the same time. Every midnight watch began the same way: a lantern lit with ceremony, a logbook open to a fresh page, and a sigh usually from the youngest apprentice who realized he had once again been assigned to the ink blot shift. Now, this wasn't an official designation, mind you. It simply referred to the time between the third and fourth watches of the night when the ink was driest, the wind was sharpest, and the human brain was least interested in linear thinking. More mistakes happened during this window than at any other hour, and not grand mistakes like miscalculating a planetary transit. No, these were the quiet, humiliating blunders, knocking over ink pots, smudging maps with one sleeve, mistaking a falling leaf for a meteor, or famously recording Jupiter as a chicken. That particular error was committed by a scribe named Bay-in, who had nodded off mid-charting and dreamt that the stars had feathers. The resulting log included a beautifully illustrated lunar rooster standing proudly in what was meant to be the southern quadrant. Lady Yun was livid. Zhou Huan was delighted. He added a worm. The thing about these nights was that no matter how rigorous the science fatigue crept in like a slow fog through the rafters, the astronomers lived by candlelight and habit, but human eyes are not built for 12 straight hours of squinting at dots in the sky, while a cat gnaws the corner of your robe. Still, the observatory persisted. Logs were kept, though sometimes only semi-legible. One apprentice, after smearing an entire page with spilled plum tea, simply drew a large circle around the blot and labeled it "Unidentified Phenomenon, Possibly Divine." The entry was never corrected. It appears in 3 later star charts as the misty moonfish. There was also the matter of the paper. During rainy seasons, it curled at the corners. During dry spells, it cracked. Occasionally, if stored improperly, it attracted tiny moths who apparently had very strong opinions about meteorological predictions. And then there were the owls. Now, owls and astronomers have always shared a certain kinship. Both are nocturnal, both enjoy silence, and both are deeply judgmental by nature. But the owls of the palace had a particular flair for mischief. One, affectionately named Minister Beak by the staff, had a habit of perching directly above the main observation platform and hooting precisely at the moment someone made a complicated calculation. Zhou Huan claimed this was encouragement. Lady Yun insisted it was sarcasm. The owl naturally declined comment. At least once a month someone would drop a lantern. This was generally not catastrophic, provided the scrolls were upwind, but it added to the ever-growing pile of accidental illuminations which the observatory kept in a basket labeled "Do not sight without approval." Several of these accidental patterns actually made their way into decorative ceiling tiles in a lesser court pavilion, proving, if nothing else, that aesthetics can survive where clarity fails. Ink blots, of course, were the least of it. There were days when the weather refused to cooperate at all. Mist would roll in and obscure the sky entirely, leading to a different kind of observation speculation. Astronomers would gather and play Guess That Alignment, basing their answers on the time of year, recent patterns, and occasionally just creative despair. Zhou Huan once won a round by correctly deducing the moon's phase based on the behavior of a nearby goat, who only chewed scrolls during waning crescents. No one challenged this method, mostly because the goat was surprisingly accurate. Lady Yun, meanwhile, took a more dignified approach. When denied visibility, she would simply recopy older observations in calligraphy, so perfect it looked printed. It was her way of reminding the sky that even if it didn't show up, she would. Sometimes the mistakes were shared. A night log from 1342 written in 3 distinct handwritings records a brief panic over a moving red star that turned out to be a lantern carried by a very lost baker. He had wandered onto the observatory roof, muttering about mooncakes, and stumbled into an impromptu star report. His name was recorded Park Jin-soo, and he later opened a pastry shop called the Crimson Lantern. It did quite well. Historians still debate whether these errors undermine the accuracy of Goryeo astronomy. Some say yes, pointing to the many logbooks with and probably scrawled in the margins. Others argue that these moments are the very soul of the observatory tradition evidence, that the stars were studied not by machines, but by fallible, stubborn, ink-stained humans who kept going even when their lanterns flickered and their notes ran sideways in the rain. After all, no one remembers the perfectly recorded moonrise. But everyone remembers the night Joe Juan tried to describe Saturn's ring tilt and instead drew a hat. That hat, incidentally, was later embroidered onto a ceremonial robe for the spring solstice. The robe still exists folded in a museum drawer. Its stitching is crooked, its fabric slightly moth-nibbled. But if you look closely just above the hemline, you can see the tiny ink mark that started it all. A mistake, a blot, a moment. Proof, perhaps, that not everything need be perfect to be remembered. The comet of 1376 arrived uninvited. It didn't streak or glide or tiptoe. It roared into the quiet way only the heavens can, an immense sweeping arc of fire and frost that took its time across the night sky like a noble with too many cloaks. And when it passed, it left people crying. Some cried for fear, others for awe, if you truth be told, because they had wagered heavily that no comet would appear that year, and now owed 3 jars of chestnut wine and a goat. At the Royal Observatory, the staff had been arguing over soup when the first sighting occurred. Lady Eun noticed it first. Her quill froze in mid-notation ink, suspended on the verge of dripping. Joe Juan squinted upward with his usual suspicion, then murmured, "Well, it's definitely not a cloud." They watched in silence as the glowing mass trailed across the stars, its tail a vast shimmer that lingered like breath on a mirror. One apprentice dropped his candle. Another began whispering a prayer meant only for thunderstorms and royal childbirths. The next morning, the observatory gates were swarmed. Officials, monks, nervous nobles, and one ambitious chicken vendor all arrived demanding answers. What did it mean? Was it a sign? Should they delay the rice tax? Would the emperor be blessed? Cursed? Both. The astronomers who had not slept did their best to appear authoritative. Lady Yun drafted a preliminary report in her most elegant script. A visitor from the edge of knowing arrives with a tale of fire. It burns neither tree nor scroll, but all who see it are changed. The direction favors east. The implications remain, as yet, ambiguous. Joe Juan added a postscript. It also made the soup taste oddly metallic, not necessarily relevant. What followed was a flood of interpretation. The palace's chief omen reader declared it a harbinger of sorrow and recommended mass offerings of rice cakes. A Confucian scholar countered that it was a reminder to pursue virtue and perhaps cancel this year's archery contest. A Buddhist monk, recently returned from a pilgrimage, claimed he dreamt of a burning bird and that this was its sign. He then fainted from exhaustion and was revived with peppered broth. And across the city, the people did what people always do. In the face of the inexplicable, they turned inward. Households burned incense. Old quarrels were revisited. More than one marriage was postponed. 2 merchants forgave each other's debts, claiming the comet had reordered their sense of pettiness. A widow sat outside her home all night whispering the names of loved ones she hadn't dared think of in years. Even the goats were unsettled. The observatory's resident trio named Fate, Chaos, and Kevin bleated all night and refused their usual thistle ration. Historians still argue whether this was an omen or indigestion. For the astronomers, the days that followed were a blur of record-keeping diagram sketching and interrupted naps. Every temple wanted an interpretation. Every noble wanted a private horoscope. Even the palace cook asked if the comet might be responsible for his failing pickles. Joe Juan, ever helpful, nodded gravely and suggested offering the pickles to the stars. He did not expect the cook to actually throw them onto the roof. Some called the comet Skyfire, others the dragon's breath. One particularly poetic report from a distant village called it the lantern of the ancestors. All were wrong and all were right, because the truth was no one really knew what it meant. Only that it meant something, that it had arrived like a question with no answer, and it refused to leave quietly. Eventually the comet faded. The sky returned to its usual glitter. The soup stabilized, but the observatory remained different. Lady Yun became quieter, her notes more precise, as though the comet had reminded her that even the stars could startle. Joe Juan, in contrast, became bolder. He began drawing hypothetical comets in his charts, naming them after desserts: sticky rice comet, mango tail burnt sugar blaze. He claimed it kept morale up. One apprentice began writing nightly letters to the comet and placing them under his pillow. No one told him to stop. And perhaps the strangest change of all, a small shrine appeared in the observatory's southeast corner. Not officially sanctioned. Just a pile of smooth stones, a burnt candle stub, and a folded piece of paper with the words, "You reminded me." Historians still argue whether the comet influenced the political decisions of that year. A sudden change in military leadership, the delayed construction of a new dam, the surprising leniency shown to a rebellious governor, all coincided with the comet's arc. Correlation, perhaps, but in the observatory logs beside the standard star maps and angular measurements someone had scrawled, the sky blinked and everyone blinked back. And maybe that's all it was. A moment when the sky stopped being a ceiling and became a mirror. So yes, people cried, not because they were weak or superstitious or looking for meaning where there was none, but because sometimes a trail of light in the darkness is enough to undo the knots we keep too tightly tied, enough to make the world pause, enough to remind us that even fire can be beautiful from afar. If you wanted to be an astronomer in medieval Korea, you needed three things: a decent grasp of the stars, a tolerance for cold toes, and a willingness to climb a ladder that probably shouldn't be trusted. The observatories, those proud stone towers with sweeping views of the heavens, were from a distance marvels of architecture. Up close, however, they were often drafty, creaky, and designed by people who clearly did not have to use them after midnight. And at the center of every observatory experience was the ladder. Now, this wasn't just any ladder, it was the ladder, the one leading to the uppermost viewing platform where the finest instruments sat, armillary spheres, sighting tubes, bronze gnomons polished to an obsessive gleam. It was the best place for observations and the worst place for anyone with even a hint of vertigo. It leaned at an angle just a bit too steep. It groaned ominously with each step, as if resenting your entire life's choices. And in the rain, it became a slick, unwelcome metaphor for ambition. Joe Juan fell off it twice, once while balancing a bowl of fermented bean curd, and once while attempting to impress a visiting noble by reciting constellations in reverse order. In both cases he was caught, not by the ladder, which had no interest in saving him, but by the conveniently stacked scroll baskets at the base. Lady Yun naturally never fell. She ascended the ladder with a quiet disdain, never looking down as though she floated upward on sheer competence. Still, even she once paused halfway up and muttered, "This ladder is testing me." At least once every season someone petitioned to replace it. And each time the palace budget officers responded with the same note, currently unavailable. Perhaps you might climb with greater caution, so climb they did, lanterns in one hand, logbooks tucked under the arm, occasionally a snack in the teeth. And at the top they emerged onto a platform battered by wind, whispering with dust, and populated by equipment that seemed far too dignified to be left alone up there all night. Here they performed their nightly rituals. They aligned instruments with the pole star. They whispered greetings to the constellations. They checked the tension on the celestial sighting cords, which always managed to unravel at the least poetic moment. They lit the viewing lanterns carefully shaded so as not to interfere with starlight, and took their places. And they waited. The stars, being stars, arrived on time. The moon, if present, glowed with her usual mild aloofness. The wind, always curious, poked at robes and tried to blow away notes. One night it succeeded, scattering Lady Yun's meticulous diagrams across the city. She found one 2 weeks later used as wrapping paper in the fish market. She never quite recovered. Sometimes the ladder itself seemed to complain. Groans, creaks, subtle shifts in angle. Once it mysteriously shortened overnight. No one could explain it, though Joe Juan suggested the observatory cat may have chewed the base. No one believed him, but no one ruled it out either. The ladder became more than a piece of wood. It became legend. Apprentices spoke of its moods. Some nights it welcomed you firm and steady. Other nights it wobbled in judgment. One unlucky novice slipped and landed in a basket of pickled radishes. From then on, the platform was unofficially known as Radish Watch. One particularly ambitious assistant named Hei Min attempted to replace the ladder in secret with a set of carved stone steps. He got halfway through construction before Lady Yun noticed and had the project shut down. If we earn the stars by struggle, she said, then let the ladder complain. It builds character. Heyman quit the observatory and became a carpenter. His ladder's history records were very stable. The climb to the top became a metaphor in observatory culture, a rite of passage. No observation was truly respected unless you'd made the climb. No report fully trusted unless your hands bore the mark of windburn and ladder splinters. The stars, it was said, looked kindly on those who earned their elevation the hard way. Still, it wasn't all hardship. At the top, the view made it worthwhile. The entire palace stretched below like a dream, drawn in ink. Lanterns glowed like distant planets. The sound of frogs in nearby ponds mingled with the quiet rhythm of scribes below. And above all above was the sky. Not just stars, but stories. Each point of light a reminder of something older than kingdoms, louder than war, softer than any bed you'd rather be sleeping in. Sometimes after a long climb and a longer watch, Joe Juan would doze off, leaning against the armillary sphere, his notes trailing off mid-word. Lady Yun would find him sigh and drape a cloak over his shoulders before returning to her calculations, because even the most judgmental ladder couldn't keep them from the work. The sacred, exhausting, absurd, magnificent work of trying to understand the sky. And when the sun finally rose, staining the horizon, with the first blush of morning they descended slowly, stiffly, gratefully, one careful step at a time. The ladder creaked goodbye, and they ever stubborn promised to climb again tomorrow.
The trouble with the stars, Joe Juan often said, is that they never agree on anything. You could spend hours sketching a perfect configuration, arcs measured positions, logged all dots, carefully plotted, and then your colleague, standing 3 feet away, would look at the same sky and say, "Ah, yes, clearly, the rabbit is weeping." Such was the nature of the heavens, consistent in their motion, maddening in their interpretation. The Royal Observatory had 17 competing methods for charting celestial phenomena, and every astronomer believed deep in their weary bones that their method was obviously the best. Most nights were peaceful enough, filled with quiet scribbling and the gentle rustle of robes. But every so often an argument broke out. These were not loud arguments. These were scholarly, dignified disputes, full of passive-aggressive calligraphy and footnotes, scrawled with increasing tension. Take the infamous Venus incident of 1369. Lady Yun, a staunch believer in the harmonic arc theory, recorded Venus as completing its evening phase just above the constellation Biak, a placement associated with introspection and the growth of green onions. Joe Juan, consulting his personal and unverified theory of emotional planetary resonance, insisted Venus had actually crept closer to a cluster he labeled the sighing farmer, implying a period of economic unrest and romantic confusion. He accompanied his report with a haiku Venus moved sideways. Regret lingers in the roots. Avoid spring proposals. The Ministry of Cultural Festivals found this alarming and postponed 3 weddings. A third astronomer scholar, Lim, rejected both readings. According to his scroll, Venus was exhibiting signs of temporary duplication, a phenomenon he illustrated with 2 overlapping dots and a note that read, "I know what I saw. Do not edit this again." All 3 reports were submitted. All 3 were quietly filed into the Department of General Disagreements, which met once a month to decide which interpretation would make the fewest people nervous. This particular Venus sighting was ultimately deemed symbolically neutral. Still, the debate didn't end there. Later that week, Joe Juan and scholar Lim engaged in a scroll duel, a noble tradition involving competing marginalia written on each other's logs. Joe's read, "Some people see dots, others see meaning." Lim replied, "Some people drink before observations." Lady Yun settled the matter by drafting a new chart, impeccably detailed and leaving it unsigned. It was so beautiful, so precise, that no one dared question it. The debate faded, and the observatory returned to its usual rhythm of ink stars and the occasional whispered insult. But this wasn't an isolated case. There was also the great dragon-tail debate, in which 3 observers described the same meteor trail as graceful suspicious and definitely judgmental, and the 3-moon illusion, where atmospheric fog caused light distortion and led a young scribe to declare the existence of lunar triplets. He was promoted shortly after, though some say this was just to keep him from talking too much. Historians still argue whether these disagreements weakened the observatory's credibility or enriched it. Some claim the inconsistencies proved that astronomy in Goryeo was riddled with superstition and artistic flourish. Others argue that the diversity of thought was the observatory's greatest strength. After all, what is the sky if not an ink blot, inviting each observer to pour their soul into its patterns? The truth is likely somewhere in between. The Gangyokgum wasn't a temple of perfect consensus. It was a chorus of slightly tired, occasionally damp humans who stared at infinity and tried to make sense of it with quills, formulas, poetry, and sometimes sheer stubbornness.
And in the process, they captured something far more enduring than technical perfection, a portrait of how humans think when they're reaching beyond themselves. Messy, beautiful, contradictory, and hopeful. Even the tools reflected this tension. The armillary spheres were precise to a fault, finicky wheels and circles that demanded calibration so fine it made apprentices cry. Meanwhile, the paper scrolls were at the mercy of ink blotches, coffee stains, barley tea stains, and cats who didn't care about constellations. Some astronomers used polished stones to mark star positions. Others trusted water clocks, though the one in the southern tower had a mysterious leak that threw off midnight readings by exactly 6 minutes. Joe Juan called it time's polite escape, and every now and then someone tried to unify the methods. One such effort was led by Master Seo, who drafted a proposal titled Toward a Consistent Celestial Framework. It was 53 pages long, referenced 22 earlier scholars, and contained precisely 0 jokes. No one read past page 6. Lady Yun, when asked for comment, simply raised an eyebrow and said, "Let the stars argue if they wish. I'll just keep listening." Because maybe that was the secret. Not solving the sky, but letting it speak in many voices. Accepting that truth like starlight arrives slightly out of sync depending on where you're standing. And so 17 interpretations bloomed under the same heavens. Some clashed, some harmonized. All tried in their own way to touch the untouchable. And every night the sky remained gloriously, infuriatingly silent. The maps were exquisite. Not the kind of maps that help you find your way to the baker's stall or the tax office, no. These were maps of the heavens inked with trembling reverence onto silk bark paper, or in one bold experiment, a stretched deer hide that had once served as a drum cover. They shimmered with effort and ambition. Stars were rendered in gold dust constellations traced with ink so fine it could only have come from a particularly introspective squid. And yet, despite the celestial elegance, no one could find their way through the city without getting lost. Because while the Royal Observatory was busy charting the heavens with mathematical precision, the ground-level streets of Goryeo remained a cartographic afterthought. Directions were given like this: go 3 turns past the bakery with the shouting wife. Head downhill until you smell vinegar, then listen for the blind zither player. If he's silent, you've gone too far. Or the ever-popular walk until the goat looks at you funny, then turn left. Street signage, none. Official maps, rare. And even when they existed, they were less geographically informative and more vague odes to important rooftops. A map of the city drafted in 1351 labels locations such as place where lanterns were dropped once and tree that isn't dead yet. Meanwhile, up in the observatory, every speck of the sky was labeled and categorized. There were divisions for the 28 lunar mansions, each with its own poetic name and associated meaning: heart, neck, wing room. Star clusters had precise declinations and tabulated risings. Celestial phenomena were tracked to the fraction of a night watch. Joe Juan once compared the discrepancy as follows: above the gods whisper to us in numbers. Below they shout directions from alleyways while holding chickens. Lady Yun, for her part, refused to even discuss ground maps. The stars never mislead, she'd say, unlike whoever labeled that turn near the bathhouse as mostly straight. It is not. This cosmic to earthly disconnect caused no end of amusement and occasional diplomatic confusion. Once a delegation from a neighboring province requested an audience with the astronomers to discuss synchronized territorial alignments. What they meant was city planning.
What they got was a lecture on lunar precession and a scroll full of perfectly illustrated stars that were absolutely useless for finding the grain warehouse. Still, the astronomers kept mapping. The Cheonsang Yolcha Bunyajido, a star map produced in 1395 and carved into stone, recorded nearly 1,500 stars with uncanny accuracy. It divided the sky into regions aligned with political territories, blending astronomy and governance in a way that impressed Confucian scholars and bewildered delivery couriers. It's one of the oldest surviving star charts in East Asia. You can still see it today, the stone slightly worn, the stars still whispering their secrets across time. But on the night of its unveiling, one very tired messenger got lost trying to bring the celebratory rice cakes to the observatory. I followed the map, he said, weeping. It told me to go north of the Ox's Nose and west of the Jade Maid. I ended up in a latrine. Still, there was something deeply human in this divide. To chart the stars is to seek order, to accept that far above us something moves with intent and elegance. But to navigate the city is to submit to entropy, to crooked alleys, to gossip-based landmarks, to goats that sleep in paths, no matter how gently you try to nudge them. The heavens were fixed, predictable, comforting. The earth, not so much, yet both were necessary. For while the observatory gave the kingdom its calendars, its omens, and its poems, the streets gave it life, messy, frustrating, stew-scented life. Sometimes the two even touched. One apprentice astronomer, frustrated with always being late to his shift, began sketching ground maps based on star alignments. He'd use the moon's position to time his route, noting that if he reached the bathhouse as Arcturus rose, he'd never be late. He called it the celestial commute method. It was mocked thoroughly until it started working. Then Lady Yun quietly asked him to draw her one too. Zhou Huan, of course, took this as license to create a whole new form of urban star cartography, mapping the locations of taverns, tea stalls, and resting goats using constellations. His favorite was the ladle of soup vendors, which curved around a busy street near the east gate and included annotations like, "Beware this one, water too thin." No one asked for these maps. Everyone used them. And perhaps that was the point. The stars didn't mind that no one could find the bathhouse. The bathhouse didn't care that Saturn was in retrograde. But somewhere between them, humans carved order from chaos, scribbling symbols into the dark above and below, hoping to get home before curfew. So yes, the observatory could tell you when the moon would rise to the breath of a gourd drum. But if you wanted to find the good noodle stand after midnight, you still had to ask the goat. It began as many royal disasters do, with a turtle going missing. Not just any turtle, mind you. This was Munshong, a mild-mannered palace pet, reputed to be attuned to lunar rhythms, and according to 3 generations of astrologers, strangely accurate at predicting emotional shifts within the royal household. Some claimed he could sense tension before arguments began. Others swore his choice of nap spot coincided with periods of imperial indecision. Naturally, when the queen's horoscope was due, Munsong was expected to perform his part. This ritual was not officially documented, of course. It lived in the margins of practice passed down like a secret recipe. The queen's astrologers would prepare her celestial reading based on star charts, planetary alignments, and the usual omens, but they would also place Munchong in the middle of a chalk-drawn zodiac circle. Whichever direction he waddled first would be used to refine the emotional interpretation. And on the morning of the appointed day, he was gone. The initial assumption was that he had simply wandered off. Turtles, after all, are known. Escape artists slow, yes, but also extremely persistent and surprisingly difficult to bribe. A small search party was dispatched. 2 pages checked the palace gardens. A steward investigated the water basin near the laundry well. Someone even consulted a monk who advised placing lettuce offerings in the 4 cardinal directions. This achieved little aside from summoning several very confused ducks. Meanwhile, the queen waited. Her birthday was approaching. The court buzzed with preparation. A proper horoscope was essential not just for tradition but for maintaining celestial legitimacy. The queen's mood, already delicate after the embroidery contest debacle, was not to be tested. Lady Yun, upon hearing of the turtle's disappearance, set down her brush with the gravity of one preparing for war. Zhou Huan muttered something about a clear violation of lunar protocol and immediately began composing a backup horoscope involving tea leaves and the angle of shadow. Under the emperor's ceremonial hat, still no turtle. Then came the rumor. Someone, likely a kitchen assistant with too much imagination and too little to do, claimed to have seen Moonshong ambling toward the royal laundry room, specifically toward the heap of perfumed linens destined for the queen's changing chamber. The implications were scandalous. A turtle amidst the unmentionables, ominous, unhygienic, possibly symbolic. Lady Yun, face like thunder, marched to the laundry wing herself, and there, nestled between a towel bearing the imperial crest and a mildly crushed lavender sachet, lay Moonshong, asleep, dreaming perhaps of lettuce or destiny. He was returned to the observatory, at once given a gentle rinse and placed in his ritual circle with all the solemnity due a creature who just brought half the court to a halt. The queen's horoscope was completed by evening. According to the report, the stars were aligned for calm reflection, unexpected affection, and a favorable outcome to any disputes involving embroidery threads. The queen was pleased. A jade hairpin was gifted to Lady Yun. Zhou Huan received a scroll of dried plums. Moonseong, for his part, was given a slightly larger bowl. Historians still argue whether the turtle truly influenced anything. Some dismiss it as court superstition. Others point to years of anecdotal evidence Moonsong curled toward the east before a successful treaty, west before a suspiciously timed grain shipment. One scroll even notes that the turtle refused to move the night before the crown prince announced his decision to take up poetry. Regardless of belief, his status remained unquestioned. Apprentices were warned, do not step near the turtle circle. Do not feed him garlic. Do not ask what he's thinking. Zhou Huan once tried to draft a sonnet in Moonsong's honor, but was told gently but firmly that the turtle preferred haiku. Even the goats treated him with a sort of confused respect. The incident sparked a brief movement within the observatory to incorporate more animal augury. Lady Yun vetoed most of these. The attempt to train a squirrel for planetary mood interpretation ended badly, and the chicken compass theory was never mentioned again. After one hen aggressively pecked the Mars chart during a lunar eclipse, still, the event was remembered fondly. For years after, whenever an apprentice misplaced a scroll or dropped a compass, someone would inevitably say, "At least you didn't lose the turtle." It became a benchmark for chaos, a way to laugh through the uncertainty that surrounded even the most carefully calculated observations. Because if nothing else, the tale of the turtle reminded them all that astronomy, no matter how precise, lies at the mercy of strange interruptions. A gust of wind, a rogue goat, a sleepy turtle in a pile of royal socks. And maybe that was the beauty of it. The stars remained fixed, but the paths we walked beneath them never quite were. They bent, meandered,
took us places no chart could predict. So if you ever lose your way, figuratively or literally, just remember, even the Queen's turtle wandered now and then. If you've never used a sundial as a towel rack, you probably didn't work in a Royal Observatory. You see, solar observation was a respectable, noble pursuit, one that involved carefully crafted devices, mathematical rigor, and a deep relationship with the shadows. But in the real world of the Gangyokgam, it also involved a lot of standing around, waiting for the sun to move while dodging misplaced laundry and listening to goats sneeze. The main sundial, a beautiful bronze disc with carefully etched time divisions and a gnomon that pointed true as a scholar's ambition, was placed in a courtyard, just wide enough to receive sunlight during the essential hours. This positioning was perfect for calculations. It was also right next to the servant bathhouse. Now, no one is sure who first decided the sundial base was the ideal place to hang damp towels, but once the habit began, it was difficult to stop. The bathhouse boys, soaked and shivering, saw a flat surface and thought convenient. The astronomers, returning to make solar readings, thought again. Zhou Huan took to referring to it as the Southern Towel Altar. He once attempted to carve a polite warning sign reading, "Sacred Instrument, do not drape linens," but it was promptly covered by a particularly aggressive woolen shawl and never seen again. Lady Yun tried a different tactic. She began placing decoy sundials, wooden, slightly crooked but passable from a distance, around the courtyard. This only encouraged creativity. At one point, the courtyard boasted 3 towel-strewn sun shrines, none of which actually told time, and all of which occasionally hosted a cat. Despite these setbacks, solar work remained crucial. Unlike stars, which twinkled poetically but moved slowly, the sun offered a dependable rhythm, a perfect burning pendulum that kept the kingdom's heart beating in steady time. Shadow lengths dictated prayer hours, festival starts, and even military shifts. One general known for being extremely punctual and extremely superstitious refused to attack unless the shadow of the gnomon touched exactly the 9th hash mark. Solar observations also helped adjust the official calendar, ensuring that seasonal festivals didn't slowly slide into disarray. Without them, you might celebrate the spring planting rite in the middle of monsoon season. That happened once. Never again. But the sundials required care, calibration, respect. They were finely tuned, sensitive to the smallest tilt. One apprentice, thinking to be helpful, cleaned the main sundial with vinegar and a rag. The resulting chemical reaction caused a green discoloration that led the Imperial Council to believe the sun had entered a new jade-infused phase. A minor panic ensued. Offerings were made. Zhou Huan had to explain diplomatically that sun rust was not a recognized omen. Then came the bird. For 3 straight days, a small scruffy bird species, unknown temperament, uncooperative, perched atop the gnomon just before noon, spreading its wings in a way that perfectly blocked the critical measurement shadow. Lady Yun tried shouting, Zhou Huan tried flattery. An apprentice attempted to bribe the bird with sesame seeds. Eventually, someone hung a mirror nearby, and the bird became so distracted by its own reflection that it forgot its post entirely. A rare victory for human ingenuity. Despite all this chaos, the work continued. Charts were made comparing solar arc with lunar patterns. Zhou Huan proposed a theory of sun moods correlating gnomon shadow behavior with palace meal quality. Lady Yun dismissed it entirely until one noon shadow curled unexpectedly and was followed by a surprise banquet of smoked duck.
She said nothing, but did begin noting the shadow angle before lunch. And yet, with all its sun-gazing and math-solar observation, had a softer side.
There was a particular magic in watching the sun's shadow creep across bronze, slow, certain like the kingdom breathing. Apprentices would gather and try to race the shadow with their fingers, giggling until someone shouted at them to be serious. Elder scholars, faces weathered like old paper, would sit quietly near the sundial, letting the light crawl up their sleeves like a warm prophecy. Even Joe Juan had his quiet moment one morning. He arrived before dawn, set up his instruments, and watched as the first light hit the gnomon. In that sliver of silence, he whispered, "You're early today," as if speaking to an old friend. Of course, the moment was ruined when a passing servant tossed a wet sock onto the sundial's edge. Still, the sun didn't mind, because in the end, solar work wasn't about precision alone. It was about constancy, reassurance, the knowledge that no matter how many scrolls went missing, no matter how many towels piled up, the sun would rise again, the shadow would stretch, the time would return. So they kept cleaning the dial, they kept chasing birds, they kept explaining over and over to confused bathhouse workers that this was not in fact a laundry altar. And every day the sun watched it all, without judgment, without haste, just a slow nod across the sky. The meteor shower began just as the emperor sneezed. It was a grand sneeze, an imperial sneeze, the kind that echoed off the lacquered rafters and sent two junior scribes stumbling over each other trying to fetch the royal handkerchief. The observatory had just settled in for a calm evening of star mapping. When it happened, a thunderous expulsion of air, a flurry of startled pigeons from the northern turret, and then fire in the sky. They weren't connected, obviously. Probably. But Joe Juan hunched over his tea, and halfway through drawing a slightly judgmental rendering of Saturn, immediately stood up and whispered, "The sky has answered." The meteor shower was not expected. The stars were meant to behave that week. No comets on record, no ominous conjunctions, no celestial moods forecasted. But there it was, dozens of streaks darting across the dark velvet night, some thin as hair, others fat and golden like the tail of a startled fox. Lady Yoon barely blinked. "Get the measuring cords, and someone write down what time His Majesty sneezed." For the next hour the observatory scrambled. Ropes were strung, angles calculated, observations made. Apprentices yelled distances like excited merchants at a fish market. A scribe began sketching each meteor's path, but gave up halfway and simply drew them as lines of dramatic flourish with little arrows and speculative notes, like possible omen, and definitely faster than the last one. Then someone tripped over the emperor's scroll box. It had been brought up by a royal courier just an hour earlier, meant to be filled with a general monthly report on celestial activity, particularly anything that might influence the emperor's seasonal robe choices. It now lay open on the stone floor, 3 scrolls spilled, and one carefully written chart flattened beneath Joe Juan's left shoe. He stared down, lifted his foot slowly, and muttered, "The stars have adjusted." The rest of the night was a blur of light and ink. Some meteors flashed and vanished in the blink of an eye. Others lingered, dragging their fiery tails across the sky like gossip. One was so large and bright that it temporarily cast shadows across the observatory floor shadow play that Lady Yoon noted resembled a heron doing taxes. Reports varied wildly. One apprentice claimed he saw a meteor split into 3 and land somewhere behind the western garden. Joe Juan insisted he felt the ground tremble. A servant passing by with soup swore that the sky spelled out the character for beware, though it later turned out he was carrying a bowl labeled Bay Pear and had just read it upside down. Back in the palace, the Emperor post-sneeze demanded an update. His astrologers, receiving the fragmented early reports, debated fiercely over what tone to strike. A meteor shower could mean fortune rebirth or chaos, or all three. One brave soul proposed a neutral summary. The sky was expressive. It didn't help that rumors spread faster than the meteors themselves. One guard claimed the celestial display was a sign the old general would return from exile. A court lady insisted it foretold the empress's next poem would win a festival prize. A merchant at the southern gate declared it a sure sign of price inflation and promptly raised the cost of gourd lanterns by 20%. Even the goats got nervous. The observatory's 3 regulars huddled near the armillary sphere and refused to be bribed with thistles. One headbutted a sundial. Still, amidst the confusion, there was awe. There always is with meteors. Even Lady Yoon, who had long trained herself not to anthropomorphize, the cosmos caught herself whispering, "Look at them go," under her breath. Zhou Huan stood with his tea gone cold, watching the streaks arc and vanish, his chart forgotten at his side, because sometimes even the most ink-stained, sleep-deprived astronomer has to stop and simply marvel. The following morning was chaos. No one had slept. The scrolls were scattered. The ink had been refilled 3 times once, using a mixture that turned out to be soup base by mistake. And the emperor, wide awake and deeply curious, requested a full, poetic interpretation. Zhou Huan, bleary but inspired, wrote, "The sky fell into itself last night, not from grief, but from motion. A sneeze began it, or perhaps a wish. We are only here to catch the ash." The emperor was pleased. He ordered the poem engraved onto a bronze plate and mounted near the East Observatory stairwell, where it immediately began to tarnish in the rain. No one minded. Historians still argue what exactly caused the meteor shower. Some believe it was part of the Lyrids, known to pass through in spring. Others suggest an undocumented celestial event, a small asteroid brushing against the atmosphere, sending sparks across the night. But in the observatory's records, the entry is simple: meteors unexpected and numerous, brightness significant, symbolism undetermined, goats displeased. Incident coincided with royal sneeze pending review, and so the stars streaked. The sky blinked, the night burned briefly brighter, and then returned to normal. Because the heavens do that. They show off, then retreat, like a royal guest who brings no luggage, says everything in a single bow, and leaves you wondering if anything has changed. But afterward, for days, the astronomers looked up a little more often, and when the emperor sneezed again 3 weeks later, everyone ducked. Zhou Huan never liked farewells. He once told an apprentice after the boy had spilled an entire ink pot on the Mars chart, "Better to be consistent than dramatic. The stars don't say goodbye, they just fade into someone else's evening." But on the last night of the copper-tongued astrologer, even he had to admit something was ending. The astrologer's name was Baek's son, though few called him that. To most, he was simply the voice. His words had once calmed a panicked court during an eclipse, convinced an emperor not to invade a neighboring province. Mars advises against it, and soothed countless mothers worried that their child was born under the wrong sign. He didn't just read the heavens. He narrated them with precision, with humor, with the kind of knowing confidence that made you forget the sky was actually silent. He was also, by all accounts, terrible at cooking, mildly allergic to pine smoke, and frequently misplaced his own scrolls. But he had a way with language.
Even Lady Un, whose approval was generally colder than winter rice, once said, if the stars ever needed a translator, they'd hire Beck. He was old now, not weak, just thinner around the edges, like a scroll reread too many times. He still climbed the observatory ladder, though slower. He still laughed, but it came from deeper in the chest, like something drawn up from a well that knew secrets. That night he announced it quietly. This will be my final watch. Joe Juan spilled his tea. Lady Un simply nodded. No farewell ceremony, no feast. Just one more night beneath the stars. The same stars he'd studied, argued over, and occasionally scolded for their timing. The sky was clear, the wind soft, the goats unusually respectful. Beck brought only one scroll with him, blank. He climbed the ladder without help, paused halfway to whisper something to the railing. It creaked appreciatively and settled into his favorite spot beside the armillary sphere. From there he began to speak, not loudly, not as a lecture, but as a conversation with the sky. The North Star has been behaving, he said, though I suspect it's hiding something. Joe Juan jotted it down. Lady Aun didn't stop him. And Mars is brooding. Again, probably still upset about that poem I wrote. The stars twinkled on, unmoved, or perhaps just pretending. He spoke for hours about the shapes between the constellations. That's where the real messages are, you know. About how Saturn always seemed a little sarcastic. About the one time he was sure he saw a face in the Orion belt. About the comet of 52 that looked from the right angle like a spoon chasing a turtle. Lady Un refused to confirm this. He talked until his voice grew thin. Then he grew quiet. At some point, Joe Juan noticed he wasn't writing anymore. He was just listening. Not with ears, but with the part of the mind that remembers what it felt like to see the sky for the first time. When the watch ended, the stars still glittered. The sky had not changed, and yet everything felt shifted. Beck descended slowly. No limp, just gravity taking its due. He handed the blank scroll to Joe Juan. Didn't write a word, he said, smiling. Felt like the sky had already said it all. Then he bowed, not the quick, distracted sort used in the halls, but a full temple-style bow to the observatory itself, to the tools, the floor, the walls, the ghosts, and perhaps to his own younger self. Lady Un handed him a folded parchment. Your final chart, she said. I recalculated it. You're no longer under the sign of the Earth Pig. You're now an honorary phoenix. Bake laughed, crumpled the parchment, and tucked it into his sleeve. Don't tell the pigs. They're sensitive. He left without ceremony. The next morning, a rice barn exploded, entirely unrelated, caused by a leaky lantern and a stubborn rat. But some connected it to Beck's departure. A shift, they said, the old voice leaves, the ground trembles. Typical superstition, typical humans. Joe Juan that evening sat under the stars with the blank scroll. He didn't write on it, he didn't need to. Instead, he watched the sky, carefully, as if waiting for a whisper. Maybe he heard something. Maybe he just remembered the sound of Beck describing Jupiter's glint as a toothy grin on a bored emperor. Historians still argue over Baek-sun's legacy. Some say he was a charmer with good timing and better metaphors. Others call him the bridge between the ancient and the absurd. A few dismiss him entirely, claiming real science begins where poetry ends. But they forget the stars don't care how you interpret them, only that you bother to look. And Baek-sun always did. He looked. There was no proclamation, no ceremony, no bell to mark the moment when the stars stopped mattering quite so much. It happened slowly, the way lantern oil runs out, not with a sizzle, but with a quiet dimming that no one notices until the room is already dark. One day, the observatory's scroll room was full. The next, a corner had been converted into storage for palace table linens. Then came the reassignment notices. One astronomer moved to tax assessment. Another was placed in charge of measuring the exact width of ceremonial fans. The night watch roster shortened. The inkwells weren't refilled quite as promptly, and the sky kept shining all the same. The truth was simple. The kingdom had begun to favor other forms of knowledge, land surveys, merchant records engineering. The stars had become poetic, not practical. Astrologers were now consultants. The queen's horoscope came monthly instead of weekly. The emperor requested his constellations only for birthdays and public festivals. Calendars were printed without lunar annotations. A war minister openly declared that Jupiter has no jurisdiction over arrows. Even the goats stopped visiting. Lady Yun lasted the longest. She refused to leave the tower until the instruments were moved. One by one, she watched the gnomons, sighting tubes, and armillary spheres carried down the creaking stairs and packed into crates. She stood by the window as they dismantled her desk. When Zhou Huan asked if she was all right, she replied, "It's not a death, just a longer cycle of night." She was right, of course. Nothing truly ended. It just transformed. The observatory building became a storeroom for festival decorations. Scrolls were moved to the archive basement. The sky charts rolled too tightly curled like old leaves. Zhou Huan, reassigned to the Ministry of Agricultural Measurement, occasionally drew stars in the margins of wheat reports. The apprentices dispersed. One became a temple painter and filled ceilings with constellations no longer named. Another opened a tea shop where every blend was named after a lunar phase. Customers could order a waning gibbous if they needed comfort, or a new moon if they preferred something subtle and uncertain. And Lady Unchi retired, quietly. She was seen once years later at a small hilltop pavilion outside the city, watching the sky with a cracked bronze compass in her lap and a cat asleep on her shawl. She still didn't like being interrupted. Zhou Huan kept writing, not star reports, just observations. Notes about how people still looked up even if they didn't know what they were seeing, how lovers pointed at constellations with made-up names, how children wished on stars without asking which ones were lucky. One night he visited the old observatory. The door creaked just the same. Dust floated in the lantern light. The ladder, patched and re-nailed, still groaned at the fourth step. He climbed it anyway. At the top, the sky stretched wide, familiar, unbothered, full. He sat for a long time. Then on the back of an old receipt for ceremonial incense, he wrote, "The stars don't need us, but we need them, not for answers, just to remember how small our questions are." He folded the paper and placed it beside a rusted gnomon. The next morning, no one noticed, except the wind. It carried the paper out the window across the courtyard, past the bathhouse, and into the stew pot. Because of course it did. The night grows softer now. The observatory lies quiet. No footsteps, no arguments over Saturn. Only the sound of old wood settling like it remembers what it once held. Above, the stars continue patient as ever. The moon has taken her place, not boastful, just present. Her light spills over rooftops, over empty courtyards, over one stone platform still stained faintly with ink and rain and memories. A cat curls beneath a bench, dreaming of something it never saw, but understands anyway. In the distance, a flute plays. Or perhaps it's the wind. Or perhaps they've become the same. Somewhere someone looks up and says, "Nothing at all." And that's enough. Everything's quiet now. You're safe. Let the rest take you.